I believe it all began with hydrogen. After all, that's what stars are made of. And astrophysicists say that we're all made of star stuff. Life, microbial, unicellular, multicellular, plant, fungal, animal, human. Chemistry is the study of elements, their properties, and the compounds and structures they build. And when we learned enough about these elements, we learned how to manipulate them for our benefit. We learned how to isolate them, recombine them, synthesize them into molecules that we could use to grow our food, heat our homes, and treat our illnesses. But unfortunately, in our quest to improve our lives with chemicals, we got a bit sloppy. Excessive nitrogen and salts from fertilizers and pesticides in our food, soil, and water. Excessive antibiotics in our bodies. And the biggest threat to our survival, excessive CO2 and other greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, oceans, and forests. So it all started with hydrogen, but also carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. These are some of the most abundant elements in the universe. It was inevitable that they play a significant role in our survival, and due to our exploitation of them, maybe even our demise. It really might all end with carbon. In order to qualify as a living thing, you must be able to metabolize energy for fuel or ATP. Green plants do this by a process called photosynthesis. Their leaves have organelles called chloroplasts that convert carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight into sugar and oxygen. This is important because these plants become our food, and our food's food. We soon figured out how to control this process and how our food grows. The agricultural revolution in the 19th century brought with it new farming techniques, new farming equipment, and an abundance of food. And chemical fertilizer. Chemical fertilizer was different because it came from ammonium nitrates, phosphates, ammonium polyphosphates, and it wasn't your run-of-the-mill natural cow poop. More food was a good thing. It meant that people could focus on other things, get jobs outside the home, learn trades, and build communities and societies. But those fertilizers were seeping into the soil, causing salt buildup and killing the microbes that thrived there. It spilled into rivers, causing an excess of nitrogen buildup and eutrophication, and contaminated groundwater supplies. We didn't think about the consequences of our farming practices and how those nitrates didn't just disappear. They wound up in our food and water. We were being poisoned by nitrogen. We were hungry, and we figured out a way to get more food. We were sick, and when Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, C9H11N2O4S, we figured out a way to get medicine. Tetracyclines, quinolones, microlides, aminoglycosides, and glycopeptides were all synthesized as a result of the discovery of penicillin. Getting a serious disease before antibiotics usually meant death, because the methods available to control the rogue microbes invading your body were generally insufficient to preserve your life. Antibiotics changed everything, and with improved medical practices and modern treatments, the human population in the 1900s skyrocketed. Antibiotics were created to treat bacterial infections, but by the end of the 20th century, we were using them to preempt infection, prevent infection, and as an alternative to good sanitary farming practices. We started spraying them onto fruit trees to increase yield. We started adding them to animal feed to keep them from getting sick in terrible living conditions. And if fertilizer is used from animals that were stuffed with antibiotics, it also shows up in crops. The availability of antibiotics helped keep us alive when we were sick, but it also made our bodies less capable of fighting infection naturally. Antibiotics also kill off good bacteria that can help control populations of pathogenic bacteria by increasing competition. Antibiotics have annihilated a lot of those populations that were naturally within our bodies, leaving a power vacuum for pathogens to fill when our immune systems are compromised. And then there are the superbugs. A lack of good sanitary practices and overuse of antibiotics have created superbugs, pathogens that have built up a tolerance to antibiotics that used to be an effective treatment, rendering them useless against an infection. Superbugs now infect more than 2 million people a year and cause death in more than 20,000. Superbugs are a direct result of our misuse of antibiotics. Ecology is a branch of biology that studies how organisms relate to each other and their environment. Advancements in chemistry have vastly improved our lives, but often at the cost of other organisms and with a blow to biodiversity. We've talked about how overuse of chemical fertilizers have affected the soil we use to grow our food and the water we drink. We've also talked about how the overuse of antibiotics has altered our microbiome and infiltrated our crops. But I'd argue that the most urgent lesson we might learn from chemistry from an ecological perspective is the overabundance of CO2 in our atmosphere. I mentioned in the beginning that all living things need to metabolize energy, and that includes societies. Our energy consumption has grown exponentially since Edison first brought electric lighting to New York in 1882. Electricity soon became a necessity in industrial buildings, homes, hospitals, and factories. Thus began our exploitation of coal. While coal mining wasn't practiced solely as a means to produce electricity, our energy needs meant we needed more coal than ever before. The coal was used in Edison's coal-fired plant to generate energy, all the while releasing pollutants like nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, mercury, and other hazardous substances into our atmosphere. The word smog soon entered common languages to refer to a smoky fog haze that settled over urban industrial areas and cities. Photochemical smog is especially dangerous because it combines sunlight and water vapor with nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxides into a thick brown fog of volatile compounds. It is incredibly harmful to our health, but smog isn't the only problem. With the use of fossil fuels like coal and oil, we introduce other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. More than 70% of those gases are carbon dioxides, CO2. Before the Industrial Revolution, the atmospheric CO2 levels had never before risen above 300 parts per million. That record was broken in 1950. A lot of people wonder how CO2 could possibly be so bad when we create CO2 just by breathing. Plants use CO2. CO2 is colorless, odorless, so it's probably harmless, right? But the reality is, the abundance of CO2 in our atmosphere is a bigger issue than the chemical fertilizers and the antibiotics combined. The amount of CO2 in our atmosphere is directly correlated to the rise in average global temperature, altering all of Earth's ecosystems. Excess CO2 is even absorbed by our oceans, causing acidification of corals and killing off keystone species that keep marine ecosystems alive. CO2 is one of the largest challenges ecologists will face in the next few years to prevent further biodiversity loss and protect us as a species. We stumbled into these problems because we needed solutions. We needed food, so we created fertilizer. We needed medicine, so we created antibiotics. And we needed energy, so we created coal-fired plants. Our understanding of the synthetic chemicals we introduced into our ecosystem was not sufficient enough to prevent negative consequences. We've exploited our chemical resources, but I'd like to believe that we've learned from those mistakes and that we are capable of repairing the damage. Maybe we won't drown in fertilizers, antibiotics, and CO2. But an understanding of organic chemistry will be necessary for us to find solutions to the problems we've created in our ignorance.